The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass. I stepped onto the terrace, wrapping my arms around myself, enjoying the silence. The house had felt too big, too empty since my husband left on his work trip. I told myself I liked the solitude, that it was peaceful. But as I stood there exhaling into the night, I felt it. Someone watching. I turned my head slowly. He was there, leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, gaze fixed on me. My husband's younger brother. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes, too deliberate, too focused. It wasn't casual. I should have looked away, acted like I didn't notice, but I couldn't. Can't sleep. His voice was low even. I shook my head. Just needed some air. He nodded, stepping closer, his frame silhouetted against the dim light from inside. Mind if I stay a little longer? His tone wasn't casual. Something about the way he said it made my skin prickle. The air felt different now, thicker, charged. My breath hitched. It was a cool night, but suddenly I felt warm. Too warm. And I didn't know why. He was supposed to stay for a few days, maybe a week at most. That's what my husband had said before leaving. But days turned into weeks, and there was no mention of him leaving. He offered to help around the house, fixing a loose cabinet door, stacking firewood, taking out the trash. Things my husband usually handled. I told myself it was harmless, that I should be grateful. But his presence started to feel too much. Too close. I caught his eyes on me more than once, lingering just a second longer than they should. I tried to ignore it, act like I didn't notice, but the air between us shifted. It was subtle, unspoken, but impossible to ignore. One evening, I walked past him in the narrow hallway, and his fingers brushed against my hand. Light, barely there, but enough to send a sharp current through me. Accidental. It had to be. But when I glanced at him, he didn't pull away right away. My breath caught. It was nothing. It meant nothing. But my pulse told me otherwise. The storm rolled in fast, thick clouds swallowing the last bit of daylight. Rain lashed against the windows, and then, darkness. The power flickered once, then died completely. I fumbled for candles, my hands unsteady. The room filled with a warm, flickering glow, shadows stretching along the walls. I turned and he was there. Too close. His face barely visible in the dim light, his presence heavy in the small space between us. I should have moved, should have stepped away, but my feet stayed rooted to the floor. His gaze locked onto mine, intense, unreadable. The silence between us pulsed, charged with something I refused to name. I took a step back, but he moved too, closing the distance. My breath hitched. I don't know who leaned in first. Maybe it didn't matter. His lips brushed mine, hesitant at first, then deeper, as if crossing a line we both knew couldn't be erased. I pulled away fast, my heart slamming against my ribs. "We can't," I whispered, but the way my voice shook, even I didn't believe it. The next morning I avoided him. Kept my answers short, my movements precise, careful, controlled. I busied myself with meaningless tasks, wiping the already clean kitchen counters, rearranging the same books on the shelf, folding and refolding the laundry. Anything to create space, to convince myself that last night was nothing. But his presence lingered. He didn't push, didn't ask, didn't try to talk about it. Yet every time I looked up, his eyes were already on me. Steady. Knowing. A silent challenge that made my pulse stutter. At dinner, the tension thickened. He sat across from me, his fingers drumming absently against the table, his expression unreadable. I refused to meet his gaze, but I felt it burning through me. A slow, deliberate test of my resolve. I told myself it wasn't real, that it was all in my head, that I was the only one feeling this pull. But when I stood up to clear the plates and brushed past him, the brief contact sent a shiver down my spine. I gripped the edge of the counter, breathing too fast. Distance wasn't working. It never would. The sound of tires on gravel sent a jolt through me. I wiped my hands on a towel, heart hammering as I rushed to the door. He was back. The relief should have been instant, but as soon as I saw him step out of the car, something inside me twisted. I forced a smile, let him pull me into a hug, let his lips press against mine. But the moment his mouth touched me, my body tensed. It wasn't right. Or maybe I wasn't. Inside, he talked about his trip, filling the room with his familiar voice. I nodded at the right moments, laughed when I was supposed to, played the role I always had. But the air felt different, heavier, as if the walls had shifted in his absence. At dinner, I kept my focus on my plate, but I could feel it. Another pair of eyes across the table. I looked up just for a second. He was unreadable, quiet, composed. But something in his stare, something sharp and knowing, made my stomach drop. My husband didn't notice. But I did. And so did he. I told myself it was over. Whatever it was, whatever had been building, it ended the second my husband walked through that door. I repeated it like a prayer, like a shield, but the cracks were already there. I avoided being alone with him, kept myself occupied, stayed close to my husband whenever I could. But he was always there. Passing behind me in the hallway, standing too close when reaching for something in the kitchen, appearing at the exact moment I let my guard slip. It wasn't intentional. Or maybe it was. I couldn't tell anymore. My husband noticed nothing. He kissed me goodnight, wrapped his arms around me, whispered that he missed me. I let him. I closed my eyes and tried to drown in the comfort of familiarity, but guilt sat heavy on my chest, pressing down with every breath. It wasn't about what had happened. It was about what hadn't. The thoughts I couldn't shake, the glances I couldn't ignore, the way my body tensed for reasons I refused to admit. The worst part wasn't the guilt. It was the fact that I wasn't sure I wanted it to stop. I found him outside, leaning against the railing, the sun setting behind him. I didn't hesitate. I walked up, arms crossed, voice steady, even though my pulse was anything but. "This has to stop," I said. He turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable, his eyes locked onto mine with that same quiet intensity that had unraveled me piece by piece. He didn't argue. He didn't smirk. He just nodded as if he had expected this. But there was something in his gaze, something sharp, something that told me he wasn't backing down. "You think you can just forget about it?" His voice was calm, too calm, and I heard the challenge beneath the surface. My throat went dry. I wanted to tell him yes, that I could erase everything, that it was nothing. But the words wouldn't come. His eyes searched mine, waiting, daring me to lie. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I turned away instead, walked back into the house, closed the door behind me. I told myself it was over. But deep down I knew better. I arrived home later than planned, the house quiet, lights dimmed. My husband had a late meeting, at least that's what I thought. As I stepped inside, something felt off. The air was thick, heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't place. Then I heard it, his voice. Low, controlled but sharp. I froze. Slowly I moved toward the living room, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. My husband stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, shoulders tense. Across from him, younger, calmer, was his brother. The look in his eyes wasn't defensive. It wasn't regretful. It was knowing. Silence stretched, suffocating, before my husband turned to me. "You want to tell me something?" His voice was steady, but I could hear the edge beneath it. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. He was waiting. So was his brother. Earlier that evening I had played the piano, searching for something I couldn't name, losing myself in the notes. My husband had been watching. He had laughed at something I'd said. Now there was no laughter. Only the unbearable weight of what we all knew but hadn't spoken. And now there was no escape. He didn't yell. He didn't demand answers. He just looked at me for a long, unbearable moment, then walked past me, grabbed his keys and left. No words. No final blow. Just silence. Somehow that was worse. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something, anything, to break the tension, but there was nothing left to say. By the time I turned back, his brother was gone too. No goodbye. No explanation. Just an empty space where he had been. I wanted to call out, to demand he stay, to ask what all of this had meant to him. But I didn't. Because it didn't matter now. The house, once familiar, now felt foreign. The walls seemed colder, the air heavier, suffocating. Every room carried echoes of something I had broken beyond repair. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the spot where my husband had slept for years, where I had once felt safe. Now it was just an empty space, a reminder of what I had lost. I had made my choices, and now I had to live with them. Alone. Days turned into weeks, but the silence remained. My calls went unanswered. His things disappeared one by one until it was like he had never lived here at all. No final conversation. No closure. Just absence. The kind that settled into the walls, into the air, into me. I told myself I would move on, that time would dull the edges of everything I had shattered. But the truth was, nothing changed. The house stayed empty, too big, too quiet. The guilt sat heavy, relentless, a shadow that never left. I kept hoping for something. A knock on the door, a message, a sign that not everything had been lost. But nothing came. Then one afternoon I saw him. Across the street, walking with the ease of someone who had never looked back. His gaze flickered toward me for the briefest second. No hesitation. No regret. He kept walking. That's when I knew. I was never part of his plans. I had lost my husband. I had lost him. And in the end I had lost myself. There was nothing left to save. I had played the game. And I had lost.